Okay, so now we're recording. So I'll start again. Thank you all for coming. I want to welcome you all to this event. As I said, it's a great pleasure to be able to launch Heather Brunskill Evans's book, Transgender Body Politics, and have Heather in Britain and us in Australia. And I'm speaking to you from Jiruland in far north Queensland. And we are going to begin with Bronwyn. Before there is just a little bit of housekeeping. If you want to comment or ask a question, please use the chat function, and you can also clap or do a thumbs up on the reaction button. The order of events will be Bronwyn Winter will speak about Heather's book and launch it, and Heather will respond, and we will gather various questions that you have on chat, and Renata will towards the end do thank yous. So please do put your questions on the chat as we're going through the launch. Not just yet, because I only have two eyes. Okay, over to Bronwyn. So Bronwyn Winter is a professor of transnational studies in the School of Languages and Cultures at the University of Sydney. She teaches European studies and international and global studies. Among other publications, she is co-author with me of the first international anthology on 9/11, which was September 11, 2001, Feminist Perspectives. That was 2002. And there was only one other book like that, and that came out of India. In 2017, Bronwyn published a follow-up monograph, Women, Insecurity and Violence in a Post-9/11 World, published by Syracuse University Press. Her next book, The Political Economy of Same-Sex Marriage, A Feminist Critique, will be published by Routledge in late 2020. She writes here that she's resolutely avoided writing on transgender, but like so many of us, has been dragged kicking and screaming to talk about it here. She has also been involved in a number of speaking and media events on the matter, and is probably best known for her absolutely fabulous contribution to the 2016 IQ debate organised by the Sydney Ethics Centre. So, Bronwyn, over to you. Bronwyn, where are you?
I forgot to unmute myself. Here I am.
Okay.
Of a slogan of Women's Place UK, which I'll talk about a little bit later, as will Heather. A lot of you may already know about Women's Place UK, and Heather does write about it in her book, but it says a woman's place is standing her ground, and there are other variations on that slogan as well that Women's Place UK uses it. And Heather actually uses that slogan as a subhead in part of her book. I'm speaking to you today from Gadigal and Wangal country, known in Gubba language, that's white people language, as the inner west suburbs of Sydney. And I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land and their elders, past, present and emerging, who have been displaced largely from this part of the world, but they are still there in spirit and in body. I'd really like to start off today, because I just watched it on Facebook this morning, acknowledging and giving a cheer, in fact, to Tasmanian Senator Claire Chandler, who has braved legal and political retribution and financial penalty to stand up to the trans agenda, and she won. In a Senate speech a few days ago, she pointed out that even she, an elected public figure, can be subjected to such threats and intimidation in attempts to curtail her freedom of speech by a so-called anti-discrimination board, then millions of other women with less cultural, social and political capital behind them, she didn't use those words, but that was the import, are far, far more vulnerable. I think she's very courageous. She's in the Liberal Party, which I would never vote for, but you know, she's taken a stand, and I think she's terrific. So applause for her. Louder, please. I'll shout K. All right, I'd also like to voice my solidarity with, I am speaking quite loudly and my volume is up on maximum, so apologies, unless I hug the screen, I can't do much better. I'd also like to voice my solidarity with Anna Kerr of the Feminist Legal Clinic, who are facing imminent eviction from their City of Sydney Council premises in Glebe, an inner suburb of Sydney, because of their affirmation of women's sex-based rights and publication of gender critical material. Anna took up the case, as you know, many of you in Australia, and you may also know Heather, the case of Beth Rep, who was a Canberra journalist who was recently ordered to pay a male to trans person by the name of Bridget Clinch $10,000 in damages for liking, simply for liking a Facebook post that criticised Clinch. Rep is appealing the decision and is crowdfunding her costs. Later on, while Heather is speaking, I can maybe put the link for the crowdfunding up in the chat if you have not already donated. The Feminist Legal Clinic provides a range of legal advice and advocacy services for women, very often for women who can't afford to pay lawyers, and is one of the few remaining women-only organisations to do so. So please, if you think of it, please write to Anna, write to the Feminist Legal Clinic and protest to the City of Sydney Council. As Susan said, as I told her to say, I've long resisted discussing the trans issue as I considered there are so many other matters of concern to women, which I had until very recently deemed more pressing, more totalizing in their impacts on women's lives. But the rapidity with which the transgender lobby has risen to a position of political influence and the number and enormity and consequences for women have forced me, albeit kicking and screaming, into taking up this discussion. And I think a lot of us are in that position today. Heather also, she tells in her book's prologue of having stumbled, her word, into researching and writing on this issue by accident because a number of incidents and personal experiences in 2015 that directly impacted on her and on her friends. She writes that, I quote, "She knew that something was really serious was happening, not only to women and children, but also to the body politic," unquote. No, not unquote. Trans identifying people make up less than 1% of the population, but the effect on society is utterly disproportionate, she wrote. From that moment, she writes, I was impelled to act, and that sets the tone for the book. I must say that myself, I still deeply resent to give what any rational human being should consider a nonsense issue this much attention. I resent having to argue for the demonstrability of biological fact and its long documented social and political consequences for women. Not because biology causes the social inequalities, but because we continue to live in societies where women's bodies, minds, and indeed whole lives are considered commodities for appropriation and consumption by men, even as those same men visibly fear and despise us. The truly frightening success of the transgender lobby demonstrates just how pervasive this ideology is and how deeply internalized, sadly, by many women who have become the new defenders of the trans agenda, and even by so many young lesbians who learn at an ever earlier age to hate their bodies and their sexuality and wish they were men. And not only in their daydreams, as many of us may have when we were kids, but in mutilating their bodies. It is perhaps unsurprising that just as we had the impression of making some progress on women's rights, at least in the letter, if not always the application of the law, including suffrage, the right to independent income and financial autonomy, anti-discrimination, affirmative action, equal pay for work of equal value, quotas in political parties, parliaments, and so on, recognition of various forms of violence against women as criminal acts, recognition of reproductive rights, sex-segregated safe spaces for women, protection of the rights of lesbian, promotion of equal rights for women's sport in terms of pay, institutional support, media coverage, and so on, and so many other areas again for which women have fought and in which areas we've made some gains. In short, just as we'd started to make some palpable progress towards institutional recognition of women as full human beings with specific needs, it is sadly unsurprising that we see such a ferocious backlash, taking such a perverse form. For if the very definitions of the terms sex and women are now open to question, and indeed are rendered meaningless as some sort of floating signifiers, themselves commodified in the gender identity market, then all the sex-based rights and protections that women have fought for and have made progress towards achieving suddenly count for naught. When otherwise intelligent, educated, rational, and compassionate people lap up the fantasies erected by the trans agenda, seize upon these fantasies and act upon them and this propaganda without reflection and in flagrant denial of reality, when they become seduced by a propaganda of victimhood and scapegoating, then we are moving closer and closer to regimes that have more to do with despotism or fundamentalist cult rule than with any sort of secular democracy. And that's a point that Heather makes very eloquently in the book. And that's why all of this is why the book is so important. In tracing the rise of the trans agenda in the UK through universities, social movements, politics, law, education, corporate funding, and the medical establishment, Heather provides detailed evidence to both debunk the fantasies on which these new despotisms and fundamentalisms have been constructed and expose the woman hatred that informs them. She rightly states that, and this is towards the end of the book, the dynamics and processes which have allowed this societal change to happen for so many years on such a scale, with so much money poured into it but so little scrutiny, deserve much closer attention, not just in order to understand the specific vulnerabilities of the historic and hard fought for rights of women and children, but also the vulnerabilities of the democratic polity more generally. And I think our democratic polities are seriously vulnerable right now because of the trans agenda and a number of other issues, but that we see this toxic masculinity that is sweeping the world. Heather's book is structured in 4 chapters, and I'll run you through them very briefly. Not all of you may have read the book. The first chapter focuses on women's bodies, on the redefinition of the term woman and the conflation of sex and gender by trans activists. She reviews some of the arguments with which we are now sadly all too familiar that redefine sex as something that we are assigned at birth, assigned with scare quotes, rather than biological reality that is observed and documented, and thus something that can be changed at will through its replacement by an individualized gender identity, producing such things as pregnant men, lesbian penises, and the many other ridiculousnesses to which we have sadly become accustomed. In doing so, she notes that this conversation is one-sided. Once again, it is women's bodies that are subject to appropriation and questioning. There is no significant trans discussion of the question, what is a man? As Heather notes, I quote, men are not threatened by constructed males and so can afford to let some into the men's club, unquote. I would also add that they are all the less threatened by the fact that there are few, if any, heterosexual women who claim to be gay men, contrary to the large number of heterosexual men who now claim to be lesbians. Importantly, Heather exposes the queer politics appropriation of conceptual tools developed by others, notably the concept of intersectionality. As some of you may know, African-American law academic Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term in 1989 to describe the experience of African-American women bringing workplace discrimination matters to court. As Black women, they experienced a specific form of discrimination that lay at the intersection of sex, race, and usually class. But the law only allowed them the channels of either sex discrimination or race discrimination. The term neatly summed up the gist of arguments made by feminists of color in the US over the previous decade and captured the imagination of activists and researchers worldwide, to the extent that it became a veritable buzzword and almost de rigueur to talk about it in one's research. And as such, it became much misused and as a result, much discussed, to the extent that Crenshaw herself in 2016 had to remind us that intersectionality was not in fact primarily about identity, and certainly not individual identity, but about systems and structures that rendered some categories or some identities vulnerable. The term has been appropriated and perverted by trans activists who also routinely deploy Judith Butler's concept of gender performativity in a process of individualized identity commodification. And throughout the book, Heather talks about this constructed intersectionality as it has been appropriated by trans activists. Because, you know, it's a trendy term and you're cool if you use it. So it's great to say you're intersectional because, you know, that means you're woke, right? The political and medical institutionalization of the discourse of gender identity is most clearly evidenced in the UK, as Heather argues and documents at some length, by the National Health Service funded Gender Identity Development Service, which is part of the now notorious Tavistock Clinic in London. Heather notes that the GIDS has operated historically within, I quote, 3 competing conceptual paradigms: medical, developmental psychology, and minority rights, quote, unquote. It is this last paradigm that is dominant at the moment and is heavily influential in the current rash of transgendering of pubescent and prepubescent girls, which is the focus of chapter 2 of the book. The minority rights paradigm means, I quote, that any response other than affirmation of a girl's claim to be a boy is understood as a violation of her human rights, unquote. This minority rights paradigm is reinforced by workshops conducted by transgender advocacy organizations, contracted and paid by schools to provide them. Girls are provided with a normative trans boy identity as the only solution to their confusion or distress about their bodies, their sexuality, or other affective or relational issues, thus binding them, I quote, to ever more tightly to the gender stereotypes which have helped contribute to the alleged identity as male in the first place, unquote. Now, experientially and in our own activism and experience these last years in Australia, we're very familiar with these stories. What Heather does is document them very carefully and look at the actors who are actually having an influence in this area, what they're saying, and what the opposing discourses are trying to also make public now. I note in passing also that this minority rights paradigm dominant in alphabet soup discourse similarly provides a justifying narrative for gay men who wish to access surrogacy services, also exploitative women with often disastrous psychological and health consequences for them. And do get my book on the political economy of same-sex marriage, because chapter 9, which is the last chapter, discusses that very point. Back to Heather's book. Her third chapter is titled The Male Body Politic. And it looks at the embracing by the British political class of transgender, including consultations that are open to the views of trans activists, but do not listen to or solicit the views of feminists defending sex-based rights. It is this acquiescence by the political class that led to the passage in 2004 in the UK of the Gender Recognition Act, which Heather also discusses. And that Gender Recognition Act allows an adult person to obtain a gender recognition certificate, which then makes it possible for them to retroactively have their birth certificate changed to the opposite sex. The law does not require genital surgery, but does require diagnosis of gender dysphoria, evidence that the person has lived as their acquired gender for at least 2 years and intends to do so for the rest of her or his life. Trans activists have long lobbied to have even these minimal restrictions removed, such that people can have their gender officially recognized through a simple act of performative speech, that is, a declaration of one's gender identity. And I think there's another country, maybe Denmark, correct me if I'm wrong, where that's pretty much possible. But the Gender Recognition Act in the UK is, I think, one of the earliest, perhaps not the earliest, but it's certainly one of the earliest. To date, those trans activists have not been successful, and the British government has actually recently backpedaled on giving credence or voice to or space to that sort of agenda. One of the highly perverse impacts of the GRA is the ability for male prisoners, which Heather also discusses in this chapter, among whom there is a high proportion, as we very well know, of sex offenders and authors of violent crimes, to request and sadly to obtain, there was the case of Karen White a couple of years ago in the UK, which Heather discusses, transfers to women's prisons where the proportion of sex offenders and violent criminals is, as we know, extremely low. Heather also discusses the activities of A Woman's Place UK, the slogan behind me, and the torrents of abuse, including physical assault, and the regular no platforming of this group for daring to advocate for women's sex-based rights, and features speakers, including detransitioners, who speak of the harm done to women due to the influence of trans activism. This harm gets compounded by the bullying, lobbying, demonstrations, physical assault of women, and so on. And I think, Heather, you recounted once being pushed down the stairs by one of them, if I recall correctly. This, and Heather's not a big woman, yes? She was pushed downstairs by a very big person. The same rights discourse that is used to promote the transing of young girls is also used to justify this abuse of feminist, on which Heather herself notes, I quote, "The Labour Party leadership remains completely silent," unquote. Does that sound familiar, Helen Daintree, up in Queensland, where the Labour Party has remained completely impervious to feminist arguments about this gender identity bullshit? This is the case even though Labour Party faithful, Labour Party members and activists and prominent figures are among those targeted, such as Linda Bellos. Linda Bellos, who was the second black woman to become leader of a local authority in Britain for the Labour Party. She led Lambeth Council from 1986 to 88. And some of us who were around in the 1980s in the UK remember her very fondly as the first Black feminist working on the magazine Spare Rib. And so, you know, she's been around, Linda, and she's been in the Labour Party for a very, very long time, and she is being unsupported, completely unsupported by her own party. Worse, actually. Heather's last chapter is titled The Naked Emperor. The metaphor is apt, and I'm sure many of us have used it in similar circumstances. She writes, and again I quote, "Despite robust evidence to show that biological sex is still extremely relevant to women's experiences of discrimination, policies that represent a profound conceptual change to our understanding of what it means to be a woman have been introduced into governance without due diligence, democratic oversight, or scrutiny. Trans policy capture demonstrates how easily systems have been influenced by the determination of single-issue, ideologically driven groups such as Stonewall, very well cashed up organization, Press for Change, and Gendered Intelligence. These organizations consist of a small number of influential actors who represent an extremely small constituency, but who have secured a monopoly on including queer theory into policymaking and law." End of quotation. Among the many troubling effects of this rule of the naked emperor, as we know, are that statistics on such things as violence against women, violence perpetrated by women, women's homelessness, poverty, and so on are rendered completely meaningless. In Australia, you will probably all recall the incident involving Evie Amati, who in January 2017 attacked 3 strangers with an axe in a 7-Eleven convenience store not far from where I live, in Enmore, because apparently she was upset that lesbians she met on a dating site did not want to sleep with her. Trans activists routinely use the term cotton ceiling to label as transphobic lesbians who refuse sexual relations with men who claim they are women. Amati's original sentence was for 9 years, with about half of that non-parole. After the Crown appealed, it was the Crown that appealed against the inadequacy of this sentence, the court doubled the non-parole period to 8 years. In 2009, Amati, who had of course been sent to a women's prison, and where Amati proceeded to pick fights with women prisoners who didn't want a man in their prison, Amati began detransitioning in jail. The court has acknowledged that he had significant mental health problems. And the issue of mental health is one that is routinely ignored by the trans lobby. Heather talks about it in the chapter on girls, and it is dotted through the book. The medical and political establishment that panders to the trans lobby also ignores this very serious issue. We have increasing evidence, and there's more evidence coming through every day as more medical professionals start to become critical of this stuff, that the so-called gender dysphoric include a far greater proportion of people with mental health disorders than the general population, and that these disorders frequently worsen, not improve post-transition. Most recently, it has been found that a higher number of supposed trans individuals are on the autism spectrum than among the general population. But Evie Amati, we must remember, mentally ill or not, Evie Amati's violence was male violence. And it's the sort very, 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 very rarely committed by women, even when they are mentally unstable. Yet in all the media reporting, Amati was referred to as a woman. So not only are women disappeared by the trans agenda, who is responsible for the violence that happens to women is also disappeared. Both Heather and I work at universities. In her last chapter, Heather discusses the thought policing of academics, including a campaign to have a gender-critical woman, Michelle Moore, removed as editor-in-chief of the journal Disability and Society. In a rare counter to the current trend of persecution of academics, the board did not stand Moore down and the journal remained successful. But these constant assaults on our academic freedom and freedom of speech, Heather's experienced it, I've experienced it, some participants in this launch today have experienced it, are stressful and fatiguing. In my own union, and I know she's here, there is a campaign by otherwise perfectly reasonable, intelligent and progressive members of the union, many of whom have PhDs, so that is, you know, supposedly some sort of proof that you have some sort of expertise in critical thinking. There is a position that these people have signed to have the national leadership of our union intervene anti-democratically to remove an elected officer from her position because of her support for women's sex-based rights. So far, the union leadership has not complied, as it would breach the union's own regulations. Yet some people in the union are now, unfortunately, lobbying for staff to have transition leave written into their workplace industrial agreements. Yeah, really. We do have domestic violence leave, which is great. That's been written into our industrial agreements in many universities, if not all, and in parts of the public service, notably in Victoria. That's great, so that women suffering domestic violence get special leave to deal with the issues that arise from that. But transition leave, not so good. University managements, of course, got into the act too. Among other things, they have launched so-called ally or pride networks, complete with training programs to complete in order to become a network member. My university does that, for example. A gender critical colleague told me that when she was told to do this training in order to be admitted to membership, she retorted, "I'm already a lesbian and a long-term activist. I don't need training for that." And she declined to join the network. Rightly so. Research projects advocating trans ideology receive significant research grants, and an elite of so-called intersectional queer scholars, my dean and my faculty is among them, unfortunately, many of them sadly lesbians, my dean also, ally with trans activists to dominate gender studies conversations. When one challenges these naked emperors, one is at risk of marginalization, public humiliation, institutional reprimand, censorship, or even prosecution. None of these impacts are, of course, limited to academics, as we know. Maya Forstater lost her job in the UK. Heather briefly discusses that case as well. There was a Twitter campaign, I Stand With Maya, which many of us probably signed or tweeted. But when our universities shut down debate in the name of some manufactured notion of minority rights or inclusivity, when individual academics face legaling, as Heather faced, or other forms of intimidation or censorship, then our universities, like our democracies, have strayed very, 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 very far from their original purpose as encoded in their written charters. Naked emperor, indeed. Because as Heather writes, I quote, "Transgenderism," and this is pretty much the last paragraph, "transgenderism, wearing a liberal democratic face mask, is patriarchy emblazoned in imperial form. The transgender movement," she concludes, "shapeshifts by wearing a cloak of progressivism, human rights, equality, diversity, and inclusion. It is particularly dangerous as it hides its authoritarianism in plain sight," unquote. The sort of scenario, in short, that is usually referred to as Orwellian. But before I depress you all completely, Heather does give us hope. She suggests that maybe, just maybe, we are reaching what is in popular parlance called peak trans, and the wokes of the world will finally stand abashed in their nakedness. Heather, I really congratulate you on this carefully researched book. It has very depressing news, but also some encouragement as you document also the work of those who are starting to push back, including medical professionals. So over to you. Thank you for your book, Heather, and I recommend it to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bronwyn, for that. So now what I want to do is I want to introduce Heather to you. Heather comes to us all the way from Britain. She's originally from Wales, as I found out before. I thought she might be with an Evans in her name. So Heather Brunskill Evans is a social theorist and philosopher who specialises in ethics medicine for nearly 3 decades. She now also works on national and international political projects, driving the rights of women and girls. She is a spokeswoman for Filia, a feminist charity, and a wonderful conference if they ever open up flight out of Australia again. A member of the management committee for Object, a campaign group against the objectification of girls and women, where she also contributes to research on surrogacy, and co-author of the Declaration on Women's Sex Rights. And you can read more of her writing on her website, www.heatherbrunskillevans.co.eu. So Heather, over to you, and thank you very much for your book. We're really delighted to be publishing it.
Thank you. And hello from a very misty autumn morning in the UK. I think it's probably about 8:30 now here. So, and thank you very much, Bronwyn, for that synopsis of the book. I won't add anything about the book because I think you've done it perfectly. I hope to convey something of the experience of the UK, which currently, which might just add another perspective. So I think you concluded by saying that I end on a hopeful note. I'm pleased that I've done that in the book, because there are so many changes going on here in the UK at the moment that have arisen from the grassroots movement which sprang up. And A Women's Place UK has been very significant in that movement. I don't know whether you know that, I think Bronwyn alluded to this actually, that only a few days ago, the reform of the Gender Recognition Act to mean that anyone who signed a piece of paper who performed being the other sex, as it were, through a signature, could actually be deemed to belong to the other sex, with all the ramifications that would entail. That was halted, and it's a huge success on the part of many women who have struggled for the past number of years to achieve that. The other thing is that the Department of Education here has rewritten its criteria for education in schools so that schools cannot employ outside agencies to come and tell children that they're born in the wrong body and so on. And there is, as you know, a case which happened in the Royal Courts of Justice last week, in relation to a young woman, Kira Bell, who was transitioned by transitioned, I use that term, it is a ridiculous term, who allegedly transitioned to male and who is detransitioning. But before I go into that, can I convey something of the surreality of actually even being part of a discussion like this? It beggars belief that we are even discussing the idea that men can be women, and that the law, all our institutions are more or less institutionally captured by this idea, and that women have to fight this rearguard action without resources, without money, and also we are punished for doing so. I would like to stop at this point and ask whether there is something that you would like to ask me, rather than me just carry on.
Heather, Mel had a question that she put in the chat. Mel, I don't know if you still want to bring that question up, but just explaining how, asking for a definition, a perhaps concise definition of the transgender. You said it was partly addressed in my speak, but you may wish to pursue that question further.
A definition of the transgender, was that?
Something Mel just put in the chat when I was talking about the transgender.
Okay. So even as I say this, what the definition is, it sounds as if I've gone down the rabbit hole with Alice in Wonderland, but what I discovered through doing the research, I started doing my research in 2015, 2016, and the more I've done it, the more appalled I have been, and I have been led to the conclusion that the transgender is quite logical, actually. The transgender is to replace the term sex with gender identity, which has a huge impact. It sounds simple, but what it does is that biology then is relegated to complete insignificance. Gender identity is brought in. The minute you bring in the idea that your gender, one's gender, is something that one just feels inside, then this opens the door to mobilizing a very masculinist movement. So the trans agenda is a men's rights movement. That sounds extreme. Even as I say it, it sounds extreme. And still I have a disbelief about it. Because of course we live in a liberal democracy where women's rights over the past century and a half they've been long fought for. They seem to be concretized in reality, in law, in medicine, in education, and so on. But in fact, the men's rights movement has found another way to chip away at those, but in the name of progressivism. This is the really serious issue. This is what we're facing. In the name of progressivism, it's found a way to undermine the very rights that quite rightly we now have within liberal democracy, by presenting it as a further development of women's rights, when actually it's an absolute regression of women's rights. And in a way, the only way to grasp this is to read my book or read other books and what women are saying, because it has to be demonstrated to believe it, which is why I think that people who are not familiar with it, with the issues, can't quite grasp what it is that feminists are talking about, because it seems like a minority rights issue and let those people just get on with it. Actually, it's affecting all of our institutions. It's affecting the rights of women and children, but it's affecting our liberal democracy. This is a very, very authoritarian movement which is happening. And it behoves all of us, to address ourselves to it. And it's very frightening, actually, that our political parties are committed to this authoritarian movement. Yeah.
It's really, I just jump in and make a comment if I may. I was recently, I recently also did another launch of Denise Thompson's self-published book, Masculinity and the Ruling of the Word. It's a very, very big book. And she actually talks about the trans agenda as being related to a whole masculinist project, which also links to capitalism and individualism.
Yes.
I think the trans agenda is a very individualistic capitalist
project. Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
It's precisely because, thank you for that, Roman, you're right. It's precisely because it goes back to the individual, and therefore, of course, sounds progressive, because it's about the rights of any individual to be, not to be marginalized, which of course we all agree with. But in concentrating on the individual, what gets lost are social structures, the materiality of the ways in which individuals are placed within society. And once that gets lost, along with the body, the biological body, what you have then, you've just opened a space for those people who are in fact privileged by the material world, privileged by the social structures, which they will not analyze because it's dangerous to do so, because it would be exposed that this is about various hierarchies, various ways that powers are exercised. And the important thing about it, the sort of gaslighting about the whole trans agenda, is that all of those issues are evacuated from the debate. What comes to the forefront, which is extremely clever, what comes to the forefront is the rights of the individual, and of course that is locked into an aspiration of liberal democracy, which is why it appears to be something that is progressive and moving society forward. And in fact, what it's doing is it's pulling us backwards. Yeah.
I'm just monitoring the chat, Susan, so I'll just jump in. I was going to say, and something that just floated past me, but there's a couple of different questions. One, why do you think being gender critical is seen as being so hateful? I find I can't even bring it up in my uni classes without facing a lot of pushback. And this is from a young woman. And then a little bit later, there's a question, how do we address what appears to be a generational divide with respect to transgenderism? And I think there's some link between those two questions. Do you have any thoughts on that, Heather? Why are we seeing it so hateful? And is there an intergenerational thing going on?
There clearly is an intergenerational thing going on, because young people have been persuaded that the movement to which they now belong is about gender fluidity. If we attempt to explain that this isn't about gender fluidity, but actually it's the reproduction of very traditional gender norms, young people are very resistant to hearing that. Now, why are young people resistant to hearing that? For a whole range of reasons. I mean, there is out and out propaganda to young people that this is the case. They learn about it in schools, that it's possible to be born in the wrong body, and that this is a very freeing thing if they understand their gender confusion through perhaps the notion that they were literally the other sex. But behind all of this, there is a cultish aspect to it. I know from doing research, this isn't just a projection on my part. I know from doing research that young people are told, don't listen to those voices. You mustn't listen to those voices. They will try to persuade you that there's something very seriously going wrong here. So don't hear them. And this is what happens. Young people imagine and have been taught that anybody who critiques it are hateful, who want to restrict their freedom, they're redundant, and as soon as such people, as myself and other older women, die, the much better the world will be as a result. So it's a very complicated issue that's going on, but we have to trace it back to, I think, the first part of this question one is, how is it that we are now, we're afraid to even speak about this? I mean, the seriousness of being afraid to utter any contradictory view or even a question. That is because the rhetoric of the transgender being a progressive has become so prevalent that I think people now even question themselves if they doubt it. They think, there must be something wrong with me. Perhaps I'm an old reactionary bigot if I think there was even something slightly problematic about me. So it's effective because not only are you being surveilled from the outside, we are all doing that sort of self-surveillance. And I've experienced it myself, actually, that sense of, my life would be a lot easier if I just stopped doing this. Of course, I haven't stopped doing it because it's of such serious importance that I can't stop doing it. And sorry, I've slightly lost the question now. What I do think, I have some advice, if we can bear to do it. The advice is that we have to join hands with each other. We keep having to speak out, because as long as we remain silent and think, well, I will remain silent, and for quite legitimate reasons, we're afraid of losing our jobs. Sometimes our homes depend on us keeping our jobs. So we're afraid at a material, practical level at speaking out. So it's gone beyond anything to do with ideology and what you might or you might not think. It's now concretized in our everyday lives. That it would be preferable not to speak about it. And so if you look at any authoritarian regime, historically, this is how the regime has been able to get a foothold, because people become afraid. And it happens it doesn't start with extremism. it starts with people's fear for their livelihoods. You know, people aren't immediately told that they're going to be dragged off to the gulag. They just get the feeling that they're not going to get promotion for that job, or maybe they will be ejected from their workplace. And this is why it is serious. We have to stop it from getting any further than the position it has now. And we can't do this individually. We have to join hands with each other to do this. We have to be a strong army, I think, to defend, to tear down the empire, the trans empire, bit by bit. And even as I say that, it sounds extreme. But what is happening is extreme. And I think that we also have to speak out to alert the ordinary person who hasn't quite grasped the seriousness of this. And so we must speak out, we must speak out and hold each other's backs as we're speaking out, and rush to defend other women and indeed some men who can also see it. Yeah, I don't know whether that's an answer to the question or not.
People are terrified. After the IQ2 debate in 2016, I got lots of emails from people thanking me, saying how scared they were to speak out, how their daughter was at university and being subjected to this stuff in a nursing course, yes, all this stuff about transgender in a medical course. So these sorts of things, it's very pervasive. I think also that part of the generational thing is also when you're young, you desperately want to belong. You want to conform. You want to be cool. You want to be seen as progressive and up to the minute with the latest progressive thing. And you know, and sort of the woke thing of the moment is trans. And if you want to be cool and you want to belong, you're pro-trans. I think there's, and you mentioned before gaslighting, Heather, that's prevalent. I see it everywhere. There are a couple other questions that I'd like to get to because people are, you know, firing away with, you know, they're coming thick and fast. There's a very specific question. I think it's actually quite, you do discuss it, I think, in the book, a very specific question about the Gillick competence. How do we address the Gillick competence? That I think
right.
you talk about in the book.
Well, yes, I do talk about Gillick competence, and I'd like to link this to the Kira Bell case, because we mustn't lose that case. We mustn't lose discussing that before we have to draw the discussion to an end. So what you just said, Bronwyn, about young people wanting to, you know, belong to a tribe, wanting to, you know, young people take up the prevalent norms, whichever generation it is. You know, there are sets of norms within that teenage group, and the teenagers will take those norms on. So, you know, we as adults, we understand that. We can retrospectively understand that with our own childhoods or teenage years, with our own children, and so on. Just at a common sense level, we do understand that about the teenage years. And the teenagers are now, the particular teenagers have a lot of trans ideology on the internet, and they're steeped in it, they're washed with it. This gets us back to the issue of whether children can consent to being medicalized. So what the business of whether Gillick competence, which is a law in the UK, established, you know, in the 1980s on another case. Let's not go too much into that. But what it does is it argues that an under 16-year-old can consent to a medical treatment without having parental consent. And there are various criteria for whether the child can consent. And I have to say, it wasn't a 10-year-old child that Gillick competence was made for. It was somebody who was established in puberty, but just under 16. So this law is being used by the Tavistock to argue that the children can consent to the medical treatment of allegedly transitioning to the other sex. So what's evacuated from that discussion is that we know that children and teenagers are influenced by their social context. But in this case, of all cases, we ignore that. in every other area of a child's life, we understand them as immature, psychologically immature, and that we will protect them until they become adults to making permanent decisions about their lives. But in this area with trans, because the trans ideology has been so effective in getting people to believe that children were actually born the wrong sex, the Tavistock, which is completely captured by trans ideology and queer theory, and I have written that in the book, now are so focused on a child's identity that in discussion about whether a child can actually consent, they resort to, but it's the child's identity. It's the child's identity, as if this was the most serious of issues, as if it was a medical issue that had to be rectified by medicine because the identity is so important. And in the court where I was last week, in the case of Kira Bell, they resorted to the issue of identity. And I know that they are convinced by the idea that identity, individual identity, of such mammoth importance that in order to care for children, we must honor their identity and effectively collude with a child's sense of identity such that 10-year-old girls will be making decisions which will render them infertile as an adult. So in the process of having this bizarre sense as I was writing the book or pre-writing the book that this can't be true, I sat in the court thinking I had just entered another realm of bizarreness where without evidence, without any scientific basis, the National Health Service in the UK would argue without apparent self-reflection that it was a reasonable thing to do, not just reasonable, a humane thing to do, to check out whether a girl can consent to something which is even unimaginable to her. The fact that she will have sexual dysfunction as an adult will not be on the girl's, it's not within the girl's capacity to even project into that. The fact that she may at some point want to be a mother is irrelevant. So all the things which may give the child a sense of gender dysphoria, the social context for it is not present within the Tavistock's discussion. So what actually happens is that, just to add to it, I hope I'm not taking up too much time here. Is this okay to continue along this line? Okay. What has actually happened in the UK is there's something called the Memorandum of Understanding. I don't know whether you have this in Australia or not, but the Memorandum of Understanding is that it was embedded into, the argument is that if you attempt to persuade anyone, child or otherwise, that their identification as the other sex has any psychological component parts to it, that is transphobic. And many psychological institutions and societies in the UK have signed this Memorandum of Understanding, which means that those clinicians who are disturbed by what is happening in the Tavistock, for example, many of them have their hands tied behind their backs because they're afraid that if they suggest that this child has a range of psychological problems which contribute to the identification of being born in the wrong body, that they will be accused of transphobia. And that Memorandum of Understanding has been cleverly based on the idea that, same-sex attracted people were pathologized by medicine, and quite clearly that was punitive, wrong, and against human rights. So they've attached that the reality that medicine did attempt to, and did indeed, pathologize same-sex attracted people. So the trans agenda has now utilized that discourse, brought it into the idea that that homophobia is attached to transphobia, and brought that right into psychological services. So it's perfect as a strategy. And I think what you were talking about previously, Bronwyn, that the mental health issues that go along with that dysphoria in children, alongside the social context in which children are living their lives, has now been pushed to one side. Gender identity the concept of gender identity has enabled that to be pushed to one side. So we have the case of someone like Kira Bell, who, by her own admission, was a very unhappy and disturbed young woman for a range of reasons, which she talks about, and arrived at the Tavistock thinking that, preferring indeed, for all sorts of reasons, to be seen and to be a boy rather than to be a girl, and to reject her female body. And of course, in order to understand that, you would have to have a feminist analysis of why a teenage girl might actually hate being in the body that she is in. And I just discuss this in the book. Instead of addressing those psychological issues, she was almost immediately put down the road of cross-sex hormones. And for a number of years, she took testosterone. She is now 22, 23. And this has had a serious consequences. Irreparable damage to her body has been created, including the fact that she then also had a double mastectomy. And the usual things that go with it, a changed voice box, a beard, and so on. And she realized that when she was, I think, about 21, that the fantasy which children are encouraged into, which is an abuse of children, a fantasy that they can actually become the other sex, when it is in fact an impossibility, dawned on her when she was about 21. And from that moment, that epiphany, as it were, she is trying to retrace her steps. And in retracing her steps and acknowledging that she's female, has always been female, that the desire to be male was caused by a number of psychological, familial, and sociological factors, she feels very angry with the Tavistock, who did not address that. And so she is very bravely has allowed herself to be an example, the one person standing in front, a myriad of other examples now of young women who want to detransition for the very same reasons that Kira Bell wants to detransition. I say detransition like this because, of course, it was impossible to transition in the first place. And so she's very bravely done that. So it's a key case. And we will hear, and then we won't hear the result of it for another 4 weeks. But whether the result goes in our favour, so the result is that we would like it, that no person under the age of 18 can consent to such treatment. And we may be successful, we may not. We're holding our breaths, but it's the beginning of a challenge to the medicalisation of children. And of course, the medicalisation of children, as I say in the book, in order to attempt to transition them to the other sex, is part of a whole network of ways in which the trans agenda is taking hold of our society. So sometimes people, they're concerned about children, but they don't make the connection between what is happening to children to what is happening, to why men can join women's rugby teams, or why the language is changing so that women can't talk about their own bodies anymore. A man who decided in his mid to late 60s can talk about what it is to be a female person. But a woman who has lived her life as a female can no longer speak about it. So people don't join up the dots. So if I was asked why I wrote the book, the attempt was to join up the dots for people to show that the medicalization of children and a man being given permission to talk about being female, where an adult human female with the range of experiences that we've had as adult human females in the society in which we live, we're silenced. We're practically gagged nowadays from speaking about that. But I'm aware I've talked for a long time, but there's one thing I would like to talk about the Tavistock again, if I may, just before I stop. And that is that the Tavistock, when asked, as they were represented in court, when asked, what is the reason why the demographic now is that the children identifying as the other sex in the past few years has shifted from boys, historically, just a very minority of boys had what was called gender dysphoria then. That word is now almost silenced because the language is transgender, to girls, the amount of young girls wanting to transition. And the Tavistock constantly says, we don't know, we need more research into that. This more research never happens. And the reason why it never happens is because it can't happen. And the reason why it can't happen is because in order to do the research, they would have to bring in all the sociological and psychological reasons why a girl might want to identify with the other sex. And that's the very thing that their ideology dictates that they have to keep out. So that's the conundrum. So it's up to us to bring it in. And that's one of the things that I've attempted to do, not just in this book, but in the two previous books that I edited with my colleague, Michelle Moore. I shall stop.
We have a number of other questions. Susan wants to put out some slides on how to order the book. Is it okay if I keep talking while you do that, Susan?
Yes, I just want to put up some slides so you can see how to get the book. Hang on, oops, hang on, escape. Okay, I'm getting there. Just bear with me while I do this. Okay.
Okay,
all
can
right.
we keep talking?
Yep,
Okay,
yep,
so
keep talking.
We have a question about intersex, and I'm just going to read it out from Hello Dog. We're going to read out the question. I think one of the things I struggle with, says the questioner, is the fact that sex is not a binary. There are people with only one chromosome or three and are intersex. Upon being born, they aren't necessarily assigned a sex or gender that they perhaps should be. Although I note intersex groups have sometimes wanted to distance themselves from the trans movement. Yes, they have indeed. So she's asking from either of us. I just want to jump in quickly, Heather, before handing back to you. Yes, there are people born with one chromosome. There are single X people who are women with Turner syndrome, but they're definitely female. There are several X's who end up with Down syndrome. If you just have a single Y, you're not viable as a as a human form, and you end up dying. You have to have an X in there somewhere to actually end up being a viable human. So it's not, the intersex, and the number of people who are truly intersex is infinitesimally small. It's like 0.00001% of the population who are actually biologically intersex in their DNA. So what we do have very often is people who have what may be called non-conforming or unusual sexual characteristics, enlarged clitoris or so on, who may not look like normal people or what is established as the norm for people of their sex. And they are often they're often pariahs or shunned or not quite right. And they're often people who end up identifying as intersex, and that's perfectly legitimate. But just in pure medical and biological terms, intersexuality is extremely rare. Then there we have a sort of a whole lot of other non-conformities with your actual biological sex, but this DNA is actually XX or XY in most cases. Heather, would you like to comment?
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Bronwyn, for that explanation. You know, I also talk about it in the book. The idea that sex isn't binary because there are intersex people who are in the tiniest of minorities, as Bronwyn has talked about, has been so powerful as a rhetorical strategy to persuade people that in some sense there's a conflation between gender fluidity, and hopefully we can not restrict people to binary gender, but that somehow that gets conflated with restricting people to binary sex, as if binary sex is a social construction. Binary sex is not a social construction. It is an empirical fact. And to have sown that doubt in people's minds calls upon the idea that we must be generous to transgender people because they have in some sense been born not quite as other people are. The overwhelming majority of people, almost 100%, of people who identify as transgender are not intersex. They simply aren't. It's not a reality. And to make an argument that, you know, because some people, a tiny minority of people are born intersex, and then there's a whole range within that, which I won't go into now. Bronwyn has covered it. It is in the book. Those people don't want to be dragged into this debate, actually. They resent it. So it's actually quite abusive of intersex people to pull them into something which they didn't ask to be brought into as a sort of prop for the transgender agenda. But the other thing is, it's simply like arguing that, you know, because nature isn't perfect, and sometimes human beings are born with all kinds of things that are not, you know, human beings are born with a head, 2 arms, 2 legs, 5 fingers on each hand, and so on. There will be variations within that. They are a minority, but we don't therefore argue. I'm going to make a silly example here, but it is as silly as this. If somebody was born with insufficient fingers, we wouldn't make an argument then that human beings don't have 10 fingers. We would see it as an anomaly. And this is what happens with the very, very rare intersex cases. It is an anomaly. It has nothing to do with transgenderism. It's utilized by transgenderism because transgenderism is an ideology. It's absolutely an ideology. We have to disconnect it from biology. And just before I finish, strangely, the transgender agenda doesn't want to bring biology in at all. It wants to keep it out because it doesn't serve it. But when it does serve it, it brings it in. So the only way in which it brings biology in is through a spurious argument about intersex. So the transgender ideology or agenda will shift shape as to when it thinks biology is important and when it isn't. When it's to do with women, when it's to do with children who have gender dysphoria, when it's to do with women, it wants to reject biology completely. When it's to do with women, that it wants to bring, as children, it wants to bring biology in. It wants to say children were born that way. And it's either because they're intersex or because for some spurious idea that people are born with pink brains and blue brains, and it's possible for somebody with a blue body to have a pink brain inside. When you actually analyze it, the arguments are the justifications for everything that's happening in relation to the trans agenda is based on such irrationality that it beggars belief. And we have to allow ourselves dare to look at the underpinnings of the argument to realize that they're completely paper thin. Once you realize how paper thin they are, then we can fight back. And I hope that in some sense the book contributes to an exposure of the inadequacies of the arguments that are propping up this huge edifice. They could almost be just blown down. We could blow them down. We could, with a puff of breath almost. But we have to do it collectively. And to do it collectively, we have to see it. So again, please read the book. I hope I've contributed in some way to people being able to see that this is irrational, not based on evidence, and in fact is hugely unscientific. I know we live in a post-truth world. We have to deal with that. There are some truths, we have to bring them back in. And biological reality and dimorphic sex is one of the issues, and material reality and empirical truth, we have to bring it back in, not keep it out, as if that would be very unkind of us to bring it back in. We have to bring it back in. To be kind to women, children, and to all of our lives.
Part of the problem is that we are dealing with doublethink and doublespeak, because black gets called white and white gets called black and sex gets called gender and men get called women and so on and so forth. So there was a question, how do we actually debunk this ideology? There's a constant denial that it is ideology. We are the ones who are being branded ideologues, TERFs and whatever. And then there's this often artificial generational gap that gets introduced that's, propagated, sort of boomers get dismissed. I mean, I have people in my classes regularly dismissing boomers as bastard and old, and and even though sort of I have all these left-wing views with which they largely agree, they set off talking about boomers, and I say, how old I am? It's actually quite funny. So there's this sort of artificial divide that gets put up between generations, where ideology sort of gets attached to various generations, and it's a completely false dichotomy. But the fact that the trans agenda is ideological, it is so hard to combat precisely because it is ideological, because there is a complete refutation of demonstrable evidence. And the onus is always put upon us to make arguments. They never have to justify or provide proof or evidence for anything they say. We always have to. And as radical feminists in very many areas, I think we face this problem time and again, and now we're facing it in the trans area. There was somebody who asked about strategies. What strategies do we use to combat this thing? And maybe we should finish on that, because is social media really going to be the way we combat this? What do we do? How do we do it? How do we debunk the arguments when no one wants to listen, when they want to all say the emperor has clothes when the emperor is actually naked? How do we actually move ahead?
I have some suggestions on that. One is buy this book. Read the book, because it is just fantastic, as you have seen. Also, go into your local, preferably independent, but not only independent, local bookshop and tell them that they must order it in. You can buy the book whether you are in Australia or New Zealand or the UK or the US or Europe. All of those places. We have copies in the UK that can be distributed to Europe. We have copies in the US that get distributed to Canada and Mexico. And in Australia, we can send you a book wherever you are in the world. And I know there are people here from Germany and Britain and Sweden and probably somewhere else, but I don't know. But also you can buy it online. You can buy it as an ebook. You can go to the dreadful Amazon and various other bookstores. You can go to Booktopia, Apple, Kobo, Kindle, and you can also buy an ebook directly from Spinifex Press if you like. But our US distributors are the main distributors for our ebooks. But just go for it, because once people start reading this stuff, perhaps they'll get some better ideas. This is very clear, and I hope that this can help generate a lot more discussion, positive discussion of the sort that we want. Maybe Renata, you can do some thanks, and then we can keep talking a little longer. The screen hasn't dropped off, and we haven't had our Zoom meeting ended yet. So Renata, if you can do some thanks.
Yes. Well, thank you to everybody. Obviously, we could keep on discussing this issue. So firstly, my thanks go to Bronwyn for a fantastic summing up of Heather's main arguments. That was really very good. And then, of course, to Heather herself for writing this book. And it was actually quite funny, Heather, you alluded to it at the beginning, because when the first draft came, it was good, but it lacked absolutely every ounce of the personal effects that you have actually really suffered and had to undergo. It was in part our fault because we'd given you sort of a word limit, and being a good woman, you stuck to it. But then you went back and actually put in some of the more personal stuff, because the personal is the political, and both go together. And it is a very excellent book, and it's a very good introduction to the debate. Now, before I put my thank you, just one thing that wasn't mentioned, it is in the book. It is, of course, the problem that we have is that the trans lobby, the international trans lobby, is hugely funded by mostly American billionaires, some of whom are now women, but of course, you know, are still men. And the woman who's actually written about this, and you quote her, Heather, in your book, is Jennifer Bilek. So anybody is interested in the monetary side of this and why it has gotten so very big for this very, very tiny group of people to be now on all platforms. It is in part because the various organizations that these trans billionaires, about 5 of them, fund, they have amounts of money at their disposition that we can only dream of. And that is a very big problem that we have. And in terms of strategies, it's the good old story. I mean, Heather, you mentioned it, you know, we have to stand up together, we have to lock arms, and we have to just not be silenced. But I mean, for Spinifex, it's a certain amount of, what's the term I should use? We take a risk in publishing this book, but then we already published Bob Jensen's book, what's it called?
End of Patriarchy.
End of Patriarchy, with a chapter critical, or mildly critical of trans. Susan is also having her next book published called Vortex, The Crisis of Patriarchy, which has a very long chapter on the whole trans stuff. So we're just the TERFs and, you know, the SWERFs as well, because let's not forget it, we also, of course, continue our critique of the sex industry. And as Bronwyn said at the beginning, you know, it is so very annoying that we have to spend all this time and money and being assaulted and assailed for of this issue, when there are so many other issues that we actually must work on, like the sex industry, like pornography, like surrogacy, etc. But we have to do it. So just a few thank yous for the women who contributed to making this book a reality. In terms of editing Heather's book, I want to thank Pauline Hopkins, who was here before, must be still somewhere there. Between Pauline, Susan and myself, we had the pleasure of working with Heather's text, which really wasn't that difficult. So thank you very much to Pauline. Then thank you for Caitlin, who is obviously here, for tweeting and Facebooking and whatever, and is trying to stand up to the bullies who tell her that she's a TERF and whatever. Mel and Damiano, our office manager, without whom we could just fold, basically, because she runs all the logistics and sends the books out. Rachel McDermott, who is in Sydney, is our media person. I never know what title to use. So big thanks for her. And you probably, when you see YouTube videos, because Spinifex, we have our own YouTube channel, so you might not know that, but there it is. And speaking of YouTube, actually somebody, if you put that in the chat, Heather also had a very interesting conversation with Jelly Kay in the UK, better known as Posey. It's long, it's 1 hour and 32 minutes, but it's definitely worth watching, and it will appear on the Spinifex Facebook, I think, tomorrow. And just the last word, Susan said where you can get the books, and I know Stephanie both from Germany who are on here. And I know there's been a bit of a delay in getting books to you in Germany from Gazelle, but and also for Sheila's book. The new books are coming, so don't give up. They will be delivered. So I don't know what else to say other than to say, let's just be strong. Let's not give in. Let's speak this very simple fact that, you know, when you're born a woman, a female, when somebody looks at you in a hospital and says, oh, it's a girl or it's a boy, it's biological reality. It's simple. It's biology 101. And we just have to keep saying that again and again and again, and not get embroiled, even in the discussion of intersex. I mean, both Bronwyn and Heather spoke about that. It's just a red herring. It's not a third sex. So let's just say again and again, we like biology. We also like, you know, the science of climate change. We like biology. Let's stick with that. So I think if anybody has something totally urgent to say, please, Bronwyn or Heather or Susan, go for it.
I have one thing to say. Please subscribe to our newsletter so that you hear about the events that are coming up and you get the links to different things. And you can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and you can check out our YouTube site, as Renata said. So please do that and engage yourself if you want to in the Twitter conversations.
Yes,
that's a way to get it out there, or the Facebook conversations, etc. It's certainly one way. If there is a great sudden increase in numbers on our side, then maybe things will shift a little, maybe not, maybe they'll just get more violent, who knows.
There was also somebody on the chat who said she's a mother of a child, of a girl, and she agrees with us, and the girl has wanted to transition, I think you said. So, you know, we have to really open our arms and stand with women who face this incredible, really assault when they want to just stand by their child and do the best for their girl. So, again, thank you to all of you for being here. And our next launch will be in November. So when you subscribe to the Spinifex newsletter, you'll hear about that. It will be Vortex, and it will be with Anna Kerr, and it will be the Women's Human Rights Campaign that is now also running seminars in Australia. And that was another question on comment on the chat. Yes, the English Women Human Rights Campaign have fantastic seminars every Saturday. For Australians, they're a bit late. They usually start at midnight. But in England, I think they start at 3 o'clock. And if you just Google Women Human Rights Campaign, it will come up and you can sign up to it. So it's definitely worth listening to them, because there are women speaking from all countries in the world, and it is really horrible what they have to experience. Like, for instance, in Colombia a couple of weeks ago. But I should now not go into talking more, just because I couldn't say anything before. And thank you, Heather, for getting up early in the morning. And thank you, Bronwyn, again. And thank you to you, everyone, seeing here. It's nice to see familiar faces. And, oh, there's Gary. I didn't see Gary before. Hello, Gary. So a bit late in the game. So have a nice day. Those of you in the UK and England, and those of us in Australia might just have a drink now. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you, Heather. Thank you. Good work. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, Susan. Thank you, Renata.
You can unmute yourselves if you want to say something now. And I do apologise, because I think that my slides didn't work. So, yeah, no. My apologies for that. It's only my second time. I didn't practice as much this time.
And I did them as a PDF instead, so that's my fault.
It's all right.
I also watched,
cheers, Heather.
I watched the latest interview with Kelly J with the New Zealand representative for women's sports, the Women's Sports Australasia, that Save Women's Sports, Ro, her name was, and the Canadian coach too, and that was incredibly powerful. So that was today or yesterday. So I recommend everybody to go to Kelly J's YouTube channel and really get inspired to get that conviction that we all say transgenderism just doesn't exist. We really have to get that into our minds, that it's bullshit. We have to counteract it. And now women on Twitter are all saying the same thing. There's an absolute revolution happening on Twitter at the moment. You can spend your whole day on it interacting with women from all over the world, because it's global. It's absolutely global. Women from Chile are coming in, women from Guatemala and Eastern Europe are coming in now. Every woman is waking up to what is going on here. And Ukraine. Today I had contact with women in Ukraine who are, and there's also a senator there, a female politician who's now speaking out and standing up, and she's onto the surrogacy industry there as well. So, and then Petra the Sutter, she's got to go. This is a very dangerous transgender gynecologist. How dare she? How dare she do what she's doing?
Well, I think we should just not even call her as a woman. She is a man.
No, she is a man. Yeah. He's a man. He's a man, absolutely, but a very dangerous man.
Petra de Sutter has just become one of the 7, I think, Belgian deputy prime minister.
Yes.
He's a reproductive biologist and also has his little finger, or rather whole hand and arm, in surrogacy, which he has given European feminists a hard time for quite some years. This is not new that you have to fight against him, but he's just made the news because he's now one of the 7 deputy prime ministers. And a very powerful individual, very much, as I said, the billionaires, the billionaires club fund him too. And he's a really obnoxious individual and uses his male privilege that he got when he was a male professor of biology. And he still uses that. We have them in Australia as well, people who got famous when they were men, and now they're women, they still use their male privilege. And you said that quite early on, this is a men's rights movement.
Yeah.
Very important point.
And a gay men's rights movement too, because Petra's very involved in the gay men surrogacy who want to buy babies for £150,000 each.
Immediately say that Gary is just underneath you, Margot, and I mean there are gay men who totally are against surrogacy, and Gary Powell from the UK is one of those men, and he has written very powerful articles which you can find under the group Stop Surrogacy Now. Yeah. But I think we have to actually, I'm surprised we haven't been cut off yet, but we probably should stop.
Are we still being, is this still a public domain that we're on now? Is this still?
It is still being recorded.
Okay, I just wanted to add to that I noticed that even between us, we're using the language of that somebody is actually a woman. We're using a female personal pronoun. It's so easy to get into.
Yeah.
Because we've been trained into it as to thinking that it would be impolite or hurting somebody not to use it. So, and also afraid that the police are going to come and drag us off somewhere if we misgender somebody. So my policy recently has been always to say he, or never, ever, ever say she when it's actually a he. And the interesting thing is, when I started to say that, I felt afraid. I thought something really bad is going to happen to me now, because the worst thing is to be misgendered. But nothing terrible has happened to me. So I think that one of the strategies, if we're going to talk about strategies, is to stop using the female pronoun. When it's a man, it is a man. And I'm really not trying to pick you up on that, because it's we all do it. But going forward, I think we should just stop it. because it's colluding.
coercion.
It's colluding with the fantasy.
Yeah.
That a man can be a woman. A man cannot.
Yeah.
Full stop. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jennifer Bilek has also said something interesting, which I don't know. She suggests we should not be using the term transitioning at all. She suggests that we use the term conforming, because it's of course very true. Your most men who say they're women now or lesbians, they look like the epitome of I don't know, 1950s extreme femininity with their wigs and their bosoms and their clothes and whatever. And she calls that we should talk about conforming instead of transitioning.
Yes.
That's a really good idea. I'm not sure how this is going to go, but then, you know, maybe if more and more of us use it, then people first they will say, oh, what is this, you know, we don't get it. But if more and more use it, maybe it is a term that will become, you know, commonplace.
Yeah.
Well, as I was talking today, I was very aware I was using the word transitioning, and it doesn't feel right to use that word because it implies that you can actually be one thing and then become another thing.
And you can't, yes.
And you can't. So it's, again, the language is conceding something to this transgender agenda, that it's possible to transition. So talking about the transitioning of children has done children such a disservice. And Kira Bell, for example, she didn't transition into a boy. She just hurt her female body terribly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. We just need to already unlearn of how we've been brainwashed. Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to go to my next webinar. Thank you so much, Heather. Big applause to you.
Thank you.
Margot, and all the work you're doing. So,
Bye-bye.
of course, everybody else will see all the fantastic work you're doing. So thank you again, and see you next time. So
see you at the next launch.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, everybody. It's been wonderful. And yeah.